Hello everyone, welcome back to Average Aviator. I'm Travis, and this video is the second episode in a series that I'm doing on an epic journey that I took from western Pennsylvania to the Idaho backcountry. Now, if you haven't seen the previous episode, you can check that out in the link in the description below. But as a quick recap, on the first leg of the trip, I had a plethora of maintenance issues, some fairly simple and some almost catastrophic. But it took me about a week to get those all resolved. And now I am in the beautiful early mornings of Dayton, Ohio, trying to head as far west as I possibly can, but the faith in my airplane is rather low. Though there were many places that I had considered as potential destinations, I had narrowed it down to just 3 areas I really wanted to hit on the trip: Yellowstone National Park, Johnson Creek, Idaho, and Glacier National Park. Yellowstone National Park is the closest out of those 3, so that was goal number 1. I knew I couldn't make it in one day, even if everything went perfect, so I just figured I would try to get as close as I could. So I was just an average East Coast pilot, and the most terrain that I had ever dealt with was the 3,000 foot ridges in the middle of Pennsylvania and some 5,000 foot peaks in upstate New York. But besides that, density, altitude, and mountain wave turbulence are really concepts that I had never dealt with before. I had heard that flying out west was a whole different animal, and boy does this trip prove that right. The first stop that I had planned was Washington, Iowa, because it was along my route, it had cheap fuel, and the leg length was only about 3 hours, which is where I like to keep it because of fuel, but also mainly because of physiological limitations. The leg from Dayton to Iowa was nothing but corn, and it was only exciting because the entire 3 hours I was looking for an emergency landing area, because even though everything was running fine, I had zero faith that it was going to stay that way. So I filled up on some cheap fuel and checked the weather during my break and found that there was some low ceilings and IFR along the original route that I had planned. I simply just altered my route to the south and found an airport in Hastings, Nebraska that was the new destination. That flight was also uneventful, though I couldn't go as high as I wanted because of the low ceilings, and I cruised towards the end of it at about 2,000 to 3,000 feet AGL. But I landed fine at Hastings, Nebraska right as all the clouds were clearing out. The FBO there was awesome. They had cheap fuel and they let me borrow the crew van to go get some lunch at a place called Runzo's, which, if you've never been, it basically sells these loaves of bread with meat and cheese just stuffed inside of it, and it was absolutely amazing. After refueling and grabbing some lunch in Nebraska, I again took off with the intended destination of Douglas, Wyoming. On my way to Douglas, I was at my cruising altitude of 8,500 feet, about 20 miles north of North Platte, Nebraska, and I was listening to the local air traffic control frequency. I heard a Cirrus check on with ATC, and I realized that on ADSB he was only 5 miles ahead of me, 8,000 feet, and headed almost the exact same direction as I was. Now, it seems like there's always friendly rivalries between different manufacturers or types of airplanes, but Cirrus pilots tend to sometimes rub people, especially Mooney pilots, the wrong way because they love to claim that they are just as fast as the retracts without having to have retractable gear. So today I was super focused on his ADSB ground speed and comparing it to mine because I wanted to see if that claim was true. Though I was keeping a close eye on the Cirrus pilot's ground speed and doing my best to keep up, because to be fair, they are pretty quick. I was also keeping a close eye on the weather, but it really didn't seem like there was any. About 20 miles ahead of me, there was this cloud deck about 3,000 to 4,000 feet above me that had some virga, but it really didn't seem like anything serious. Virga, if you don't know, is just rain that is falling from a cloud but doesn't reach the ground. It looked very benign. It was a simple cloud deck. It didn't last for very long, and I've flown underneath clouds, especially well below clouds like that, and never have had anything. As I was keeping an eye on the Cirrus's ground speed, I noticed that it was holding steady at 140, but then all of a sudden it jumped up to 160 and then was slamming down to 120 and then back up to 170 and then right back down to 120 again. I really didn't understand why his airspeed was jumping around. It didn't quite make sense until I hit it. As soon as I got underneath that cloud, I was slammed by severe clear air turbulence. The turbulence was so severe, I had my hands and feet completely full, just trying to keep the aircraft under control. I've never experienced anything like that, and maybe that's a common occurrence out west, but it hit me like a brick wall. After about a minute of really severe turbulence, it finally started to subside, and I went and grabbed the iPad back out from underneath the seat and got back on course. But I noticed that the Cirrus pilot had actually actually turned around and started diverting to an airport you definitely could tell he didn't intend on going that day. So I think it's safe to say that I won that race, and I'm actually kind of surprised he didn't pull the chute. Although that turbulence really wasn't exactly fun in my book, I actually am glad that I went through it because it ended up saving my ass. As I neared my destination of Douglas, I noticed that about 50 miles to the south, there was a large storm right over Camp Guernsey. And there was some light green blips on the radar to the north of that to me looked like just rain. I could actually see through it. And in the east, you know, you can fly not really close to thunderstorms, but if it's just raining with some scattered thunderstorms really far off, you're typically fine. You know, the rain clouds are not typically an issue. They're usually pretty benign. And that's the way I was thinking as I was heading toward Douglas. In front of me, there was just a line of small rainstorm. I could see through it. And, you know, how bad could it possibly be? But I thought back to the clear air turbulence that I had encountered just prior to this. And I thought, well, you know, hey, if that could do that without really anything seemingly causing it, perhaps that rain isn't benign as I might expect. So maybe I should land at the only airport in between me and there. So I ended up finding an airport called Lusk, and I landed there instead. I tuned in the weather at Lusk, and it was calling 7,800 feet density altitude, which is way higher than I'd ever experienced before. But I just flew the airplane like I always had, and I kept the speed under control, and I landed fine. And I even had the plane stopped and turned off at the taxiway 2,000 feet down. I'm really glad I decided to land instead of try to fly through those rain showers, because no sooner did I have the airplane tied down that I was seeking shelter in the small little tiny pilot lounge and watching the storm roll through, whipping the rain sideways and making the Mooney jump and jostle about like crazy. It really made me appreciate the saying, I'd rather be on the ground wishing I was in the air than in the air wishing I was on the ground, because I would most certainly be wishing I was on the ground if I had tried to fly through that. I sat in the pilot lounge for about 20 minutes until the storm subsided. Once it did, I fueled up the airplane and I met a local pilot who had a Cessna 182, and I was trying to find a way around the storms that seemed to be popping up everywhere, as well as the mountains that were in between me and going further west. The local pilot told me of a dam and gorge that was to the north, and it looked like I could go head up that direction to get myself away from the storms and on the backside of the mountains. So I decided to make my next destination Graybull, Wyoming. After fueling up the airplane, I took off, and I was full of fuel and full of baggage, and I was probably 300 pounds below max gross weight. And I still, even with 7,800 feet density altitude, was off the ground and wheels up by 2,000 feet down. On this flight, because of the high density altitude, I was fighting high oil temperatures the entire time. Older Moonies can be known for having high oil temperature problems, and mine is definitely one of the ones that likes to run hot. I didn't really know exactly how to combat these high oil temperatures because I'd never had them this hot before, but I tried the technique of keeping the mixture rich because I figured that might help cool things down. But it turns out that keeping the mixture rich really isn't a good way to cool your oil. Now, when I was at Lusk, I wasn't listening to the weather during the storm, so I'm not entirely sure what the winds were there. But as I passed Sheridan, Wyoming, I noticed there was a line of rain showers and storms that were passing through there as well. I was tuned into the weather there, and I kid you not, the weather went from 5-knot winds to 55-knot winds in the span of a couple minutes. It was insane. I was very glad that that was 30 miles away from me and not headed in my direction. I even gave it a lot more berth, which took a little bit more time, but I wasn't getting anywhere near that. And that really showed me how volatile the weather can be out west. I continued up my route and found the dam that the local pilot had told me about, and so I turned to the southwest over the gorge. This was the first time I'd really seen this parts of the west from that altitude, and boy was it gorgeous. My last stop that day was South Bighorn, Wyoming, and besides the 1,000-foot ridge that crossed about a 1 nautical mile on the approach end of the runway, it was really an uneventful landing. So I landed at South Bighorn, I parked, I found the pilot lounge, which again, Wyoming, you need to step up your pilot lounge game. The one at Lusk was a windowless shack, and the one at South Bighorn was pretty much just a room with a chair, and I mean, at least I had a window, but it was also full of spiders. So I just plugged in my iPad, my phone, and stuff like that, went back, set up my tent. I think I made like a wrap or something like that for dinner, and pretty much just passed out. I had flown 11 hours that day and about 1,200 miles, so I was absolutely wiped. I just set up camp and went to sleep. The next morning, I had a Cliff Bar for breakfast, packed up all my supplies, checked the weather, and it looked like that day was going to be absolutely beautiful. So I decided to pack everything up, fuel up the airplane, and head over to West Yellowstone, which the route of flight would take me directly over Yellowstone National Park. I fired up the Mooney and taxied down for the engine run-up, but once again, during the run-up, when I switched mags, the engine ran extremely rough. I thought maybe it was lead fouling, but I tried to burn it off like you normally would by leaning it out and putting high RPM, but that didn't work either. And I thought, oh gosh, man, like not again, I'm broke in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. I taxied back and shut down and called my mechanic, and I told him about how the previous day I had been fighting high oil temperatures and I tried to keep the mixture really rich. And he said that it probably isn't mag, it's probably just a fouled plug. Even if I had tried to burn it off, sometimes if you run really rich for long enough, you can have a much harder buildup in one of the plugs. This is where I learned another very important lesson, which is if you're going to bring a toolkit with you, make sure you tailor it to your aircraft. I had brought a generic tool set with me just in case I had broken, but I didn't really tailor it to the aircraft, and therefore I didn't have anything to actually pull spark plugs with, which if you're gonna make an airplane toolkit is one of the basics, so that was a failure on me. I didn't have the ability to pull one of the spark plugs, and there wasn't anybody around to help me. So we decided to try to take it up in the air and try to burn it off in the air. So that's what I ended up doing. I took off in the early morning. It was still rather cool, but because I had previously started the engine and ran it up to temperature, the oil got extremely hot on takeoff. The red line on oil, where you should immediately pull the power back and find the closest airport to land at, is around 250 degrees. On takeoff that day, I was nearing 230, which is concerning. So I pulled the power back and I circled around the airport just in case, and I kept the climbing to a minimum. I kept minimum power on the engine, and it seemed like the oil temperatures were coming down, and they had only spiked because it took a second for the oil to absorb the heat from full power on takeoff. Once the oil temps came down to about 215, I pushed the power up again and started heading west away from the airport. Everything seemed to be running fine. I did a mag check in flight after I leaned it, and it seemed like my missing problem had gone away. It was probably a fouled plug. I was climbing up to 12,500 feet as I passed over Cody, Wyoming, and I headed up the right side of a canyon with the Shoshone River at the bottom. The views were absolutely stunning. I had never been that close to mountains of that size before. The air seemed absolutely still. There was no turbulence coming off the mountains. It was actually kind of cold up there, which was good for the engine. Seeing Yellowstone from the air was absolutely amazing, and I found myself staring down at all the mountains, lakes, and geysers even. I crossed over Yellowstone National Park, and I ended up landing early that morning at West Yellowstone Airport. West Yellowstone is a really cool airport that I had heard about because it has a dedicated campground on the airport. You can literally just park your airplane and then take all your stuff into the woods and camp out there. You can rent a car and go into the park, or you can just stay there, and they have free bikes that you can take into town or ride around some of the trails around there. So that's what I did. Though West Yellowstone was an awesome airport and had a great time there, and I probably could have spent a number of days there, I really wanted to get to my next destination, which was Johnson Creek, Idaho. So I filled up on fuel in West Yellowstone and I headed out pretty much direct to Johnson Creek, which took me over mountains pretty much the entire time. Again, the entire time I was looking for potential landing areas, but this route really didn't have very many favorable options, but it was absolutely beautiful. So my plan on this flight was to approach Johnson Creek from the north and then turn around and land to the south after completing a normal pattern. But what I didn't understand is that Johnson Creek is in a very narrow valley. I mean, I knew it was in a valley or canyon, but I didn't realize exactly how narrow that canyon was. As an East Coast guy, I had never been in anything like that. So I had no way to really understand exactly how narrow the canyon was. So as I approached Johnson Creek, I had this plan of a normal pattern, and when I got to overhead the runway, I realized that that was not going to work. And so I had to figure it out on the fly, which when you're dealing with a plane like the Mooney that doesn't like to bleed off airspeed as well as others and is a lot less forgiving when you're fast, it really, when things throw off your planning procedures and you're not ready for it, it can make an approach a lot more hairy. In order to compensate for this, I figured that I needed to get as much room as I possibly could, which meant putting the wing as close to the trees as I was comfortable with, which meant that I pretty much was shoving my wing into the trees. And I descended a little bit on my downwind and just followed the terrain contour of the canyon walls, which ended up turning into a keyhole. During the keyhole, the other thing that was extremely important that thankfully I learned earlier was figuring out how to bank sharply but not pull. Normally, if you try to overbank the airplane, especially low to the ground, and try to load it up by pulling, you can get slow and end up stalling or spinning the aircraft into the ground, which is really bad, obviously. But I learned that if you bank the airplane relatively steeply, but don't pull and just let the nose slide through, you can either gain airspeed or maintain your airspeed, but also still keep your turn radius a lot tighter. Once I got back around from the other side of that and I could see the approach end of the runway, I realized I was right on glide slope, right on my airspeed, and I landed there without any issues. It was absolutely beautiful. I'm sure there's faster and heavier and harder airplanes that have landed there before, but being a relatively low time pilot that had come all the way from Western Pennsylvania and absolutely sticking the landing at Johnson Creek, which I understand is not the most difficult runway in the Idaho backcountry, but it really didn't matter to me. That was such an accomplishment to be able to do that I felt so great when I was taxiing in and shutting down. So that amazing sense of accomplishment after finally landing at Johnson Creek, Idaho, after flying all the way from Western Pennsylvania, is where I'm going to leave you in this episode. In the next episode, I'm going to make my way further into the Idaho backcountry and eventually make my way to just 20 miles south of the Canadian border, where, you guessed it, I find myself having even more maintenance issues. So if that interests you, please consider hitting the subscribe button and waiting for the next episode. Or if that episode is already out, you can click the link in the description below. If you have any questions, feel free to leave some comments or leave me a message on Instagram, @aviator. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you.